All right, welcome back to Vijñapti. I'm joined again by our good friend Nick Bright. Nick, it's good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking we're going to do something a little bit different. We had spent a decent amount of time doing a book review on Evan Thompson's book for the last few episodes. But today I'd like to get a more foundational and a little bit more fundamental. So we're going to be looking at kind of doing an intro to religious scholarship a little bit. I had sent Nick some questions of various phrases that I find myself using a lot, and within the domain of religion and religious studies and religious scholarship. And the reason that I wanted to do this episode is because one, religion is very important to me, not necessarily in my practice of it, but I just find that as I'm exploring, my understanding of consciousness, religion offers a very deep and profound language for different concepts that we can utilize in our investigation of the nature of the mind. So, um, I wanted to break it down so that, in the future, when I reference these words or when I say these words or when you say these words, people can have a good understanding of what that is. Nick happens to be a religious scholar, so we have, the pleasure of having his insight here. And yeah, I'm looking forward to this.
Me as well. Yeah. These are my bread and butter terms. And so I'm glad to be able to talk about them.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, anything before we get started that you'd like to add to that intro?
Nope, I think I'm good to go. I think that it'll come through whenever we get into the terms.
Okay, cool. Awesome. So, just to start, I know that you had said you're referencing a book that you read previously. Which book are you gonna be kind of drawing upon for this discussion?
Yeah, yeah. So I mentioned this in the some point in the Why I'm Not a Buddhist book review series. But Daniel Powell's 10 Theories of Religion, now I think it's 11. Um, these terms and these ideas come up a lot and are defined and explained a lot in that book because it introduces and presents sort of digested or summarized religious theories that you can read without having to dig into, like Sigmund Freud's original cocaine fueled manuscripts about, you know, edible complexes and whatnot. Um,
Sure.
and then additionally, during my grad school experience, um, the intro religion class for undergrads, Religion 110, it was called, and the intro religion class for religious studies master's students, they used the same textbook. And
Mm,
the difference, so to speak, was that the undergraduate class was basically using it the way you would normally use a textbook. They were using it to learn the terms, learn the dates, learn the names, learn the concepts, and be able to apply them, right?
mhm.
In the grad student class, we were using that text in order to understand the pedagogy of religious studies in an academic sense. And we were using it also to evaluate it. So think
Could you
of it,
define pedagogy? Maybe that's a good place to
that is
start.
a good place. Yeah. Pedagogy is the study of how to teach and how students learn, right?
Mm,
So the method
all
with
right.
which you present information in a classroom setting. Um, you
Okay.
know, do you just spit out a bunch of names and dates and that's that? Or do you look at primary sources and texts and read them and make your own interpretations of them? Those are two different pedagogical methods.
Okay.
Um,
Gotcha.
and then, so we were using it. So you could think of it like the professors picked this textbook for this class, and the grad students were the alpha testers. And we were going through, like in an alpha test for a video game, trying to find bugs, trying to find spots where kids could get messed up, trying to find spots that could have left a little bit more, to be desired. And in doing so, we were giving the department feedback and also learning how to do this ourselves. Um,
Mhm.
give them feedback about, okay, this textbook's doing just fine. It's fine. It works, whatever, whatever. Uh, it kind of misrepresents Judaism. It kind of misrepresents Buddhism. It kind of does
Sure.
this. It's good and bad in these ways.
Right, right.
They could decide then, does this align with our goals? Does this align with the learning outcomes we've set for this class and for the sort of learning outcomes for the religious studies major for all the
Mm,
classes in this department? Does this support and inform and reinforce later religion classes that we want them to take, even if they're an engineering major, right? You know,
sure.
and so whenever I was there, the textbook that we had landed on, and I believe the one that's still being used, was by Prothero, and I think it was Introduction to World Religions, or something along those lines. If you look up the
Okay.
name Prothero, there's not very many people named Prothero out there, and
Sure.
basically that book presents, the major world religions in categories and discusses a little bit about their history, their doctrine, and what people do.
Right.
And what I love about that book in particular, and what we kept coming back to in my first class as a master's student in religion, was that book presents religion not as, you know, here's all the doctrines, that's it. Here's the important people in history, that's it. It has a strong emphasis on the assumption, so to speak, that religion makes people do things.
Mm,
It makes people do things. It informs what they do, and it prescribes them to do things. And in defining and understanding religion, that's sort of what we should be looking at, because
mhm,
there are no complete good theoretical definitions, but there are things we can point to and say that's a Buddhist ritual,
mhm,
that is a Christian
mm,
behavior, that is a Jewish action, that is, et cetera. This is
sure.
a practice of a religion or some other.
Sure.
And so, we look at like Christians praying. That's
Yeah.
that's that's something that Christians do because of Christianity. We look at Muslims going to mosque or, doing the prayers facing Mecca every day. That is something they do because of Islam, right?
Sure.
And so couching it in those terms then makes religion make a lot more sense and gives you a handle to grab onto, at least to start with, because those theoretical definitions are important, but understanding it in a practical sense is actually pedagogically super foundational.
Yeah. Awesome. So, that last part that you just described, is that something that you are taking from the book, or is that your own take, or is it both?
It's both.
Okay. Yeah. I so thank you for that. I really like that take, because I think that something that academia is sometimes stricken with is this over braininess of like, let's figure out what all the theoretical concepts are, and be super meticulous about that. And that's fine. That's very necessary, and I would say it's very important when you're studying religious doctrine, scriptures, written stuff, etc. Um, but kind of, and I think you had made this point last time with science a little bit, when you take it out of the academic setting and put it up against the real world, maybe the most general stuff would hold true, but all of the kind of, finer details, I feel like could very easily fall apart, not because the researchers aren't rigorous, but because that's life, and uh, I won't, I could go on, but I appreciate what I perceive as an appeal to the direct practice of religion, um, as opposed to, maybe hyper fixating on doctrine, which isn't bad, but it's not all of the picture, and it's not the full story of religion.
I agree. I had many moments, especially in classes that we were in together, where we were talking about these doctrinal differences that on the surface seemed minor and were quite significant in a
Hmm.
theoretical sense, but I was sometimes left wondering, okay, so then what did people do differently? Or we would read a text
Sure.
and spend so much time like trying to understand it, trying to figure out what it actually said. And I was like, okay, but do people chant this? Do they read it? Do they bow in front of it at an altar? And 9 times out of 10, the answer is no. And
Right.
it's like, okay, then, well, this text is very important for a doctrinal or a linguistic or a theoretical reason. But if only, if I'm one of 1,000 people in all of history who has read this, then it's a situation where it's like if a tree has fallen and and no one's
Mhm.
there around, does it make a sound?
Does it spread the Dharma?
Right. Yeah. And it's sort of like, okay, well, yeah, I can see this tree has fallen, but am I the only one who knows? Am I the only one who cares?
Yeah, sure. I the first thing that comes to mind as you're saying that is we have explored the Changwei Shilun of
Mhm.
Yogacara Buddhism in several of our classes, and our professor Alexander Mayer at the time had said, we're some of the few like literal handful of people who are reading this stuff right now, and I'm sure you were as well as our friend Turner Reeves very much loved it, but I can also relate to the extent that I'm like, how much of what we're doing like will act can actually influence people's lives? Um, not can it, but like,
How much does
does
it?
it? Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I really like how you frame that because it's kind of like, well, let's not forget the living embodiment of the thing as well. Okay, cool. Awesome. So thank you for that introduction with the book. I'm just going to jump right into it. So I had sent Nick some questions asking about some terminology that I find myself using a lot and that I think is very pertinent to um, this discussion of consciousness um, that can be derived from religious studies. So, Nick, my first question to you is, what is ontology?
Ontology is sort of the branch of philosophy. So there's overlap with
Mhm.
the study of religion, right? But it is essentially a category of questions whose sort of end goal to answer is what is the nature of being? What is the nature of the thing in front of me? What is the nature of things, right? And so, under that, there's like several different subfields and several scholars we could talk about for days and days and days. But
Sure.
essentially, what is the thing and what is its relationship to other things? What is its
Hmm.
nature? And is that nature shared? Is it unique? Sort of what are the implications of the thing being the thing that it is? And
Hmm.
so, whenever we ask, what is religion? That is an ontological question. What is what is
Okay.
religion is an ontological question, and it has been attempted to be answered at least 12 times, right? But like I've said
Sure.
a bunch of times, it's been attempted to be answered dozens of times, and the 12 are just the most famous that we have in
Hmm.
that in 12 Theories of Religion by Daniel Pals. But it's an ontological question in many ways, and it's other types of questions too. But it is essentially, in a metaphysical sense or in just this world sense, what am I looking at? What is this thing? And it sounds
Right.
like a jargony term for a simple question, and it kind of is. But
Hmm.
when you go about answering that, it's a lot harder than it seems.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And thanks for clarifying that. I guess kind of just use the shorthand interpretation of ontology. But you're absolutely right. It does have its own philosophical intellectual lineage, although I don't know exactly what that is myself. Um, but so, if I could bounce an example back to you just for the sake of clarification. So I have this canned pineapple chunks with me that I was going to eat after this. So I guess with respect to the consilience essay that I wrote, I'm thinking of two different kinds of ontologies, a scientific ontology and what I could just make up like a quasi-religious ontology. So to me, a scientific ontology would be saying, well, the ontological nature of these pineapples is it has some plant cells, it has some fiber in it, it has some vitamin D, it has some iron in it. Basically looking at the physical structure of that thing from an atomistic or materialist perspective, as we understand in Western science. Um, but let's say, I'll just make up a random culture and I think that this pineapple has pineapple spirits and that this is a can of pineapple spirits that have all, I don't know, kind of formed a little community and that's why we get pineapples. So I'm actually holding a can of a communal pineapple spirit entity. Um, is that kind of does that kind of point towards what we mean by ontology in either scientific or religious terms? Is that kind of okay?
Yeah, it points to it in both because
Mhm.
when you look at it from an atomistic point of view, a material point of view, then you're speaking to the ontology of things according to this discipline, this edifice we call science, which says that all matter came from the Big Bang and it has these physical properties. And I say physical meaning the laws of physics, right? And
Mhm.
then you're pointing to a religious ontology, not religious ontology as a whole, because there is no
Mhm.
such, but
Sure.
a religious ontology, which we might call in scholarship animism. Animism is a
Sure.
religious ontology. It's also sort of, in some ways, an epistemology, which we'll talk about in a moment, but it is an ontology in
Mhm.
the sense that it assigns a metaphysical meaning behind the thing in front of you. For science, that
Mhm.
metaphysical meaning is, well, this is an instantiation of, you know, this is a piece of data that contributes to the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe.
Mhm.
And for an animistic ontology, you know, the fact that this thing is alive and changes and exists in a different form than it did when it was a seed or when it was just a pile of dirt. That's sort of
Right.
an animistic metaphysical ontology speaking to its nature as having a spirit that animates it.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, those are two different ontologies for the same thing.
Okay. Awesome. Cool. Um, Perfect. So I think that's a good summary of what ontology is. I think you conveyed you know, what it means most generally to me pretty well. Let's move on to epistemology. So you had just mentioned this word epistemology. What is epistemology?
Epistemology is a field of questions, again, a philosophical one that includes
Hmm.
religion, but not all the way. And it's a question of how do we know something?
Hmm.
So this is a question of essentially like what is the relationship between our knowledge and the world around us? Is that a one-to-one relationship? Because I know that my mouse pad is red, is it red? Or is that
Hmm.
an artifact of my senses? Because I know that, and this is hypothetical, I don't actually believe this, but because I know that God is real, does that make it true? Or
Hmm.
how do I know that God is real? Do I know that God is real because the mountains and the rivers and the trees?
Hmm.
Is that evidence? Should that constitute evidence? Is there logic there? You know,
Sure.
it's the question of sort of how do you even know that you exist, right? I think that whenever Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, that's sort of an epistemology in its own right, right? In some
Hmm.
ways. It's sort of a metaphysical claim in the sense that consciousness emerges out of idealism, but it's also an epistemology in the sense that, like, I know that I exist because I have consciousness, because I think. It
Hmm.
works sort of both ways, right?
Sure.
Existence emerges out of idealism, and idealism is an artifact of existence. So I guarantee that
Sure.
I exist because I think, right? It just deals with its methods, its validity, the
Hmm.
scope. Um, Plato's world of the forms and world of the senses, these are epistemologies
Hmm.
imposed upon reality. He's sort of saying we can break up all things that we know into these two realms, right?
Hmm.
And it has overlap a lot with logic. So it's like, can you
Sure.
say X based on, A, B, C? Is
Hmm.
that actually possible? And so a lot of like argumentative styles in an academic sense come out of epistemology. right? And so this one has admittedly a little bit less overlap with religion, but you can often say, like, let's bring it back to animism. You say that this thing is animated with spirits or gods. How do
Hmm.
you know? And that's not a
Hmm.
critical, judgmental question. It's a matter of saying, tell me what indicates that to you, right? Explain,
Sure.
explain your claim. And in explaining the claim, one might say, oh, I know this because, like I said, it used to be a seed and then a plant and then a fruit. Or I know this because it nourishes me. Or I know this because I have this religious experience or mystical experience when I eat it, right? It's it's sort of the means by which you justify that which you know to yourself and to others.
Gotcha. Um, yeah, thank you for that background on epistemology. So my next question is, what is the relationship between ontology and epistemology? I wrote it wrong. But I'd like to turn it to the example that you just gave, actually, of mystical experience, because we did go over briefly last time Dr. Justin Sledge's video on mystical experience. So that's still kind of fresh in my mind. Um, if we're, yeah, if we're going to look at the relationship between ontology and epistemology within the context of mystical experiences, and feel free to reference the video as you'd like to, what can we say about that relationship and I guess differences as well?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, we spoke about how ontology is the question of the nature of being, crafting arguments about this thing has X, Y, and Z nature. And epistemology sort of asks the question, okay, well, how do you know? Right? You've decided X, Y, and Z is the metaphysical nature of this thing, the function of this thing in reality. Tell me how you know. And so, in the context of mystical experiences, at least from a philosophical or from an academic or from a study of religion's point of view, Dr. Justin Sledge was applying ontology and epistemology to mystical experiences in that video we watched. He was like,
Mhm.
okay, well, are these mystical experiences actual metaphysics happening in real time? A religious thing? Are you tapping into something that actually is out there? And then he we discussed, he concludes, well, you can't know. And then
Mhm.
he was then saying, okay, you've come back from this mystical experience and you've said we should do X, Y, and Z. Then he was asking, how do you know? And again,
Mhm.
he concluded, well, you can't really trust him that far because everybody comes back with a different sort of argument for what you should say, right? And so he's applying the latest in logic, the latest in ontology, the latest in epistemology to a body of mystical experiences with the goal of sort of seeing, are there patterns? If there's patterns, that might indicate something. Is there consistency? Well, there's not. That sort of thing would indicate a little bit more grounding as well. Is
Mhm.
there verifiability or falsifiability? He said, well, it's understandable to ask that question, but you really shouldn't for X, Y, and Z
Mhm.
reasons. And so he was sort of doing the thing in that video, and in that they were holding hands together. And
Mhm.
in some ways, in the study of religion, we do that all the time. Um, I think that it's a little bit more old school nowadays, because we sort of have gotten to a point with most major religions where we know what their ontology is and what they say, what we at least know what they say their ontology is, and we at least know what they say, you know, their epistemology is.
Mhm.
I know God is real. That's an ontology for the universe.
Mhm.
And how I know is X, Y, and Z. That's changed all the time. We study changes in those things. And also now, in the last 50, 60 years, there's been a push towards studying what religious people do. And in studying doing, epistemology and ontology are just in the background, and you're really not asking or challenging those ontologies and epistemologies. You're asking, how does what they're doing relate, connect,
Sure.
embody, reflect those epistemologies and ontologies? And to bring it around to my field of study, sacred spaces, what I'm really trying to do is examine, is this ontology expressed in physical space, right? Is this sort of epistemology presented in front of you? Is it performance of this by means of physical space and statue programs and artworks? And how the space is used, is that, like I said, a reflection and embodiment of epistemologies and ontologies that are, you know, I guess you could say, undergirding the
Hmm.
religious tradition in question, in this case, Japanese Buddhism. And so
Sure.
it's sort of, these are tools, right, that religious scholars use to examine the world and
Sure.
examine and make claims uh, about religions in history and in the present.
Sure. So I'm going to give a scenario that I just came up with and then kind of give some ontological and epistemological questions and answers. So let's say I am at an altar overlooking the ocean, just somewhere, I don't know where. And someone comes up to me, I'm praying, there's a full moon, and someone asks me, "What is this place?" And I say, well, this is the sacred temple of the moon or something like that. And this is where, humans can commune with the divine spirit of the moon goddess. And they say, oh, okay, well, how do you know that? And I say, well, I had an experience where the moon goddess talked to me, and they told me that this is a sacred space where I can, uh, I don't know, rejuvenate my essence or something like that. So when that person asks me, what is this space? To me, that's kind of the ontological dimension that they're pointing towards. What is this space? And then when they ask, so how do you know that about this space? And I recount that I essentially learn or derive that understanding from experience. To me, that's the epistemological dimension of that scenario. Is that kind of about right? Or
Yeah.
um, okay.
Yeah, that's right on the money. Yeah. And that's sort of, as lightly and as carefully as we can, that's what religious studies scholars attempt to do. Because
Hmm.
you remember I said earlier, how do you know can come off as a judgmental and aggressive question.
Hmm.
Because then it's like, oh no, you're challenging my worldview. You're challenging how I
Sure.
understand reality to be. It's like, no, I'm not
Hmm.
challenging it. I want to know about it. I want to know
Yeah.
what it is. I don't, I'm not, I'm not saying anything about it. Just I want to understand it, right?
Yeah.
And especially
It's
because
not ascribing a moralistic value judgment to it. It's just literally trying to understand how
yeah,
you arrived at that knowledge.
but the fear is sort of justified because of the historical and colonial nature of academia, sort of that's baked in, right? Because
Hmm.
I wouldn't be on that soil asking that person, how do you know, if
Hmm.
not for having made use of colonial methods and colonial sort of pathways that, you know, obviously we're post-colonial now, but
Hmm.
we're still making use of those old entrenched colonial things, and we have to
Yeah.
sort of acknowledge and attempt to decolonize those things so that you're careful and that you're not and so that you're handling something that's not yours in a very nice way.
Yeah. I just as a quick aside, I think it'd be worth it perhaps to do an episode on common cognitive biases or cultural biases or whatever in religious studies, such as
Mm.
um, you know, uh colonialist like mentalities towards, religious studies, Orientalism,
Mhm.
so on and so forth. Um, just because I feel like, it's definitely less prevalent now, and that's a good thing. But if you know, I think it's worth it to just be aware of our own biases.
I
So
agree.
yeah, yeah. But cool, awesome. I think that gives a good sense of ontology and epistemology and their relationship. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add to that?
No, that takes care of it for me.
Awesome, sweet. Okay, moving on now to cosmology. So, um, yeah, from my understanding, cosmology doesn't just apply to religious studies, it also applies to science as well.
Mhm.
Within the scope of religious studies, however, because that's what we're talking about today, what is cosmology?
Cosmology is a question about the nature of the cosmos, the heavens, the universe that we're situated in. So fundamental to cosmology is the assumption that the planet that we're on or the sight line that we have, there's more to reality than just that. There's the planet we're on, but there's also outer space. Obviously, people in history before the 50s didn't go to outer space, but they had an assumption that it was there because they can see it at night, right?
Yeah.
Um, so and also just it's an extension of object permanence. It's the sense like, oh, I can't see that there is this, but I know that something is there, right? And
Mm,
it's the question of what is it? So you can't see the layers of heavens in Buddhism. You can't see heaven or hell from earth in Christianity. You can't see the you can't see the Crab Nebula from earth without a telescope,
mhm.
but you know or believe that it's there for some reason. How do you
Sure.
know? Epistemology. Um,
Mm,
but cosmology is an argument about, okay, the world is made of four layers. Hell is the lowest layer, purgatory is the next lowest, earth is one layer, and then heaven is the fourth layer, right? That's a sort of a Catholic way to look at it. Or
sure.
there's six realms of transmigration. That's a Buddhist way. There's the demons, there's the hungry ghosts, there's the animals, there's the people, and there's the two types of gods,
Hmm.
right? That's a cosmology.
Mm,
The heavens are arranged thusly. That's a cosmological claim. And
sure.
scientists do it too. And I tend to believe them because they look, right, and they can see, and I can then see. And
Hmm.
so whenever they say the heavens are arranged thusly, they have pictures, you know, or in some
Sure.
cases, they've been to the place, or
Yeah.
something unmanned has been to the place. And so
Right.
I'm inclined to say, oh yeah, it is arranged thusly because we spent
Sure.
a percentage of our yearly national budget to build something to go there and come back and tell us, or go
Yeah.
there and report back. And so, you
Right.
but again, saying I believe that is an imposition of very recent ways of thinking. The
Hmm.
believing or the verifying by your senses is prioritizing a certain epistemology over another. And
Hmm.
we don't need to do that. We just need to know that um, the way that we think that the cosmos is arranged and our place in it, in terms of this, James Webb telescope images and, you know, lunar landers and interstellar probes, that's not the only way to
Hmm.
look at how the cosmos is arranged. People from different times and different cultures have historically and to this day have very, very different ways of understanding how it's arranged. And we need to sort of be aware of that and look at that. And
Yeah.
that's a portion of sort of doctrinal religious studies is like, what's the cosmology of Buddhism? What's the cosmology of Judaism? What's the cosmology of this tribal religion that I've
Hmm.
encountered on this island that has had no contact with anybody else for thousands of years? Right.
Right.
And then you can again ask, how do you know? And
Hmm.
get started on the epistemology of it all.
Yeah. Um, Thank you for that. I wish I had asked this question in the questions that I sent you, but is cosmology kind of the dimension of religion that most entails mythology or mythological figures? Kind of the first thing that comes to my mind as you're talking about cosmology is, like the pantheon of Greek gods, and it's like
Mhm.
um the conception of the universe is not simply the stars and the planets and the celestial bodies. Well, and in Greek mythology, to the extent that it is, they're also they are gods. The celestial bodies are eternal beings, and have their own lives and desires and so forth. So is cosmology does that is that the dimension that most entails, yeah, this idea of there being beings, gods, spirits, etc.
In some ways, yes. So you've
Hmm.
asked a couple of questions in that question.
Hmm.
One of them, you found the immediate limit of the term cosmology. The immediate limit is something like the Greek gods, because they believed that
Okay.
their gods were actually there. Like they believed if they went to the mountain, they would see them, they would find them,
Uh,
they would be able to interact with them. And so
okay.
like that's a limit of cosmology, because then you're starting to get into a place where it's like, okay, I've been there, they're not there. What, how do you reconcile that? It's not a matter of judging and saying your religion is wrong. It's a matter of saying you say they're there and they're not. There's a disagreement of terms, right?
Yeah.
That's a
Or observation.
exactly, yeah. That's a limit of cosmology, because it's sort of it's sort of it's a category that we impose on a certain it's a category we impose on a certain amount of text and doctrine that speaks to, you know, this abstract idea of that which is beyond our current reach
Hmm.
or their current reach at the time. And then you're talking about myth.
Hmm.
Myth is also kind of an interesting recent modern Western category imposed on top of a body of text, legends,
Hmm.
lore, and
Sure.
lore that they they serve a particular function. And one of those functions is to situate the me in the we and the we in the whole universe.
Hmm.
But it does more than just that. There's a lot more going on than just that. Uh, but then when you're talking about like pantheons as universal forces, you know, the god of the wind, the god of lightning, the god of the stars, you know, the sun god, um, these are cosmological sort of attributions. And so what we're really finding out in this, in answering this question, is essentially that, you know, these categories are useful tools only to a certain extent, and reality doesn't always match up. And
Hmm.
that's where things get interesting, but also complicated, right?
Sure.
There's instances where stuff doesn't fully sit well.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So I'm not sure, how to articulate this the most correct way, but I guess if I were to pose a question with what we just talked about, would you say that cosmology perhaps is more oriented towards ontology than it is towards epistemology, in the sense that it's saying the universe is this, or the outer limits of the universe can be defined as such.
Yeah, I think it would be
Is
fair
that?
to say that like
Mhm.
cosmology is sort of, you could say, like a subset of ontology. But you know, it gets complicated, like I said, because these
Yeah,
are modern Western words that we have
mhm.
invented to talk about, you know, they're boxes that are a certain shape, and reality is not always that shape.
Sure. Yeah, and that's a great point as well. Um, cool. Anything else about cosmology?
Mm-mm.
Awesome.